Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Call the order the September 8th meeting of the Admin Committee. Do we have any comments by any of my colleagues, any of my fellow board members? Here. Hearing none, moving to item 2. The approved travel. Mr. Nashie, do we have any both travel or out-of-country travel to report?
So Dr. Burke, Councilmember Mitchell and I were recently at the Asilomar conference in Monterey that focuses on transportation solutions as they relate to air pollution. And they are organizing a trip.
Video.
They are organizing a trip.
I'm sorry, Dr. Parker was asking me about where his, he said he had a board assistant to be put on the board, and he didn't see it on there this morning.
It's on item 6.
Item 6?
Yeah.
Okay, we missed that. Okay,
Okay. So
I'm sorry.
So I was saying with regards to out-of-country travel, we've been invited to Europe, specifically to a demonstration in Netherlands that would focus on Rotterdam in particular, where they're looking at zero emission technologies. And in part, one of the things that we wanted to look at was some of the other manufacturers such as Siemens and perhaps Volvo. And unfortunately, we just got the information last night. I'd like to at least make you aware of this and bring to you early next week a potential trip that would be on October, starting October 11th through the 14th, and then tie in a couple of days. Perhaps, Matt, you could explain the Siemens and Volvo portion.
Yes, so Dr. Berg, we've been in contact with both Volvo and Siemens. Volvo, both of them have said they'd be happy to host our board members if they do have a trip to Europe. Volvo has electric buses in service. I think it's in Germany and in the Netherlands. And then Siemens has agreed to host board members if they want to see the test track that's in West Germany.
Okay.
I have a statement. If that would occur, and obviously it would probably occur before any next admin committee,
Yes.
I would suggest that we also try to have staff to visit the refineries that allegedly converted from HF to sulfuric acid
In England.
So, Dr. Parker,
To,
we'd be happy to have further discussions with you on that. I believe we have a briefing scheduled for you, but it may not necessarily be necessary to go see those refineries, and I can explain more later.
okay.
Well, we may want to consider this morning authorizing me to approve this travel in the interim, since it's happening between admin committee meetings, and we can retrospectively approve it at our next admin committee if, based on my tentative approval after this committee meeting. How's that?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, if I can get a motion to that effect from my colleagues, I'd appreciate it.
I'll
move the motion.
Dr. Burke.
Second.
Okay, would the clerk call the roll?
Vice Chair Benoit?
Aye.
Councilmember Mitchell?
Aye.
Dr. Parker?
Aye.
Dr. Burke?
Aye.
Motion passes.
Okay. That motion is approved. Okay, then we have, any questions on our agenda for October? Any comments you'd like to make, Mr. Nastri?
Thanks, Dr. Burke. It will be a busy board meeting. We have set hearings for Rule 415, which is odors from rendering facilities, as well as a set hearing for possibly Rule 1420, as well as Rule 1180, the refinery fence line and community air monitoring.
I'm sorry, I missed the last sentence. It was kind of garbled.
Sorry about that. That
No,
was
I got the rendering.
okay. The other one was Rule
But the
1180, which is the refinery fence line and community monitoring.
Okay, great. Okay, item number 5, Mr. O'Kelly.
Good morning, Dr. Burke, committee members. This item is a status report we bring to you every month to talk about the information management projects that are moving forward. Chris Marlia retired. His last effective day was this Monday. Ron Moskowitz is here. Ron's the new assistant DEO over IM. Ron was most recently the chief information officer for the LA County Treasurer Tax Collector's Office with a staff size about what we have here, working on similar size systems. So we're happy to have Ron here. He's sitting here to my right. I'll talk about some of these projects, and obviously Ron's been here about 3 weeks.
Before you go on and tell us about those projects, since the retired gentleman was my favorite target, I don't want to make you my favorite target.
Okay. I don't want to be a favorite target.
Okay. But, they sent me that email yesterday asking me to review the website.
Yes, sir.
And that just wasn't possible. So, I mean, you could get to the cover page, the initial page, but after that, everything was kind of in limbo.
Yes.
Number one, I think that the entire revision of the website should be finished, and then all the board members be allowed to look at it before it's released to the public.
Correct.
Because just because I've worked on it for a long time doesn't mean that the rest of my colleagues don't have some real valuable input into the process. And I think that way you'll stay out of now. My key thing is how the public who is non-technical find out information from this district, because this district is made up of very academic people. And so their intelligence level is obviously higher significantly than the public norm. So their ability to weave through informational aspects of a website are superior. So the ones you don't want to let test this website are people from our organization or kids. What you want is that segment in between. Some old people like me and some medium old people like Kurt. Okay, so and see if they can handle it. Okay.
Got it.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, Mr. O'Kelly. Why don't you go ahead?
No, that was probably more valuable than what I'm going to say, Dr. Burke. So just moving through the enterprise GIS system implementations moving forward. Ron and staff are going to be meeting with Esri, our contractor, next week. The permit systems online application process, that's getting ready to be deployed here in the next about 30 to 60 days. It was demoed to the permit streamlining subcommittee. The demonstration went very well. The system's working from start to finish, and so at the end of the month we'll be having users beta tested just to make sure there's not anything else the users will want. But that's moving forward well. The IT review, so we held off on getting the contract wrapped up until until Chris retired and the new ADO would come in. So again, that's a comprehensive review of all of the IT infrastructure here at the district, and so this will be helpful, I think, with Ron being in here in moving forward, identifying best practices and where we need to change things. Beyond that, there are multiple projects that are moving on as expected. The agenda tracking system, we're running parallel for the board meetings of October and November. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions on any particular projects.
Any questions for Mr. O'Kelly?
Chairman Burke, I would just suggest that with our new technology person, that, and I would imagine this would happen, that there be review of what's on the table with this substantial sum of money, and make sure that the money is being well spent and needed for our purposes.
What do you think about that?
I think that would be a very good idea.
I do too. Would you like to put that in a form, an action form?
Well, is it needed to be an action form?
Councilwoman, what I say is Ron is going through all of these projects here, and there's an item coming up, item number 7, where we're doing something a little different than what Chris had planned based on some of the analysis that he's done. So I think that's already been occurring over the last 3 weeks, and that's anticipated to be ongoing. So I think you'll see this adjust a little bit over the next few months as Ron gets more familiar with what it is we're doing.
All right, thank you. I think it's just sort of a direction from our committee to our technology people.
Right. Right. Okay. Item number 6.
This is the one that's separate.
Other than Dr. Parker's assistant, do we have any other board assistants that are being approved?
No.
No? Okay, I'll take a motion on that.
I'll move approval of the item.
I'll second it. Can you hear us, Ben?
He says yes.
Yep, I can hear you.
Yeah, he can hear us, he just can't talk to us, huh?
He came to.
Okay. We have a motion and a second. Would the clerk call the roll?
Vice Chair Benoit?
It takes me a second to unmute this thing. Aye.
Oh, there he came. I heard him.
Councilmember Mitchell?
Aye.
Dr. Parker?
Aye.
Dr. Burke?
Aye.
Motion passes 4-0.
Okay. Okay, item number 7.
Thanks again, Dr.
Mr.
Burke.
O'Kelly, you're back up.
Thank you, Dr. Burke, committee members. This item requests authority to issue a purchase order, a 1-year purchase order for software licensing, maintenance, and support for the database system that the district currently uses for our class system, which is the system that is primarily used for all of our core activities, permitting, inspection. If you look back at the report that Chris originally prepared, we were looking at maybe a 3-year agreement. Ron's taken a look at that, and we're getting cost savings by going with a 1-year agreement, plus it allows us flexibility to potentially make a move next year. But in the meantime, we feel it's important to issue this purchase order now to keep moving forward with the system we have. But next year round, we may be coming back with something different. So I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Mr. O'Kelly, I have a question. Are we so tied to the system that we have now, not that I'm suggesting anything about change, that the operating system that we're operating under would be very difficult to change to go to something different? Or is it modular to the extent to go to a different type of operating system if we had to?
Dr. Parker, I'll let Ron talk about that.
Yeah, so it is a significant change because we have about 30 applications under the class system.
And so it would probably take us a year, 2 years to actually migrate over to something different.
But Dr. Parker, so that's part of the work that, again, Ron's been here 3 weeks, but this is part of the work that's going to occur as part of the comprehensive IT review. So this item is really just to keep us going forward short term, but I think as Ron stated, it's not something that can't be done, and if it makes sense, that'd be the recommendation that would come back to you, in the next 9-12 months.
Okay. Thank you.
Chairman
Okay.
Clerk, I will move the staff recommendation on this item.
I'll second.
Second.
Would the clerk call the roll?
Vice Chair Benoit,
Aye.
Councilmember Mitchell,
Aye.
Dr. Parker,
Aye.
Dr. Burke,
Aye.
motion passes 4-0.
Item 8, Mr. Miyasato.
Dr. Burke, so my Assistant Deputy, Dr. Jason Lowe, will give the staff report on this item.
Good morning, Chairman Burke and members of the committee. This item is about SCAQMD was awarded a grant from NASA to work with the Goddard Space Institute as well as the Research Triangle Institute to use a low-cost PM 2.5 sensor network to help improve satellite measurements. The SCAQMD's role is to select a PM sensor and to work with citizen scientists to deploy and operate this network and make the data available so that satellites can compare their data to the sensor network. If successful, this project can then be further eligible for a 3-year extension with additional funding. So this recommended action is to recognize almost $76,000 into the general fund and also into the STA budget for recognition and appropriation.
My biggest question is, Mr. Chairman, the dollars that we are going to be receiving versus the effort that we have to put forth, is it neutral?
So for this particular project, yes. I mean, the amount of sensors that we would be deploying is about up to 25. And as far as the collaborative effort with the citizen scientists, many of them are volunteers, and many of the operation of these sensors is generally maintenance free, especially the ones that we're looking at to use for this project.
Are these the little home units like?
So this one specifically is what we're looking at is the Purple Air sensor. So roughly they're a couple $100, and that already includes the data port to the web, where they are interfaced and visualized online.
Right. Right. I got it. Vice Chair.
Yeah, but I just want to say that I've got one of these at home. I'm enjoying using it. It's been working for about 8 months, and it's a great way to get some data. And I'm very encouraged by this. I think it's a great way to use or take an opportunity for someone that's already got a network going and back on them. I'm really wholly in support of this, and the more of these we can get out there, the better.
Duly noted. Then we will let you make a motion on this item.
Move approval.
I'll second.
Would the clerk call the roll?
Vice Chair Benoit,
Aye.
Councilmember Mitchell,
Aye.
Dr. Parker,
Aye.
Dr. Burke,
Aye.
motion passes 4-0.
Okay. Item number 8. Oh, I'm sorry. Item number 9.
Good morning, Chairman Burke, committee members. This item is to authorize the purchase of toxic vapor analyzers, or TVAs, and also to remove some old TVAs from our inventory. TVAs are routinely used by compliance staff to monitor for hydrocarbons and verify compliance at refineries, landfills, oil and gas operations, and to investigate complaints as appropriate. Currently, we have an inventory of approximately 26 TVAs that are as old as about 15 years old. 8 of them are currently in a state of disrepair. They don't work. And the remaining units are still in use, but some of them, in terms of whether they're going to be supported by the manufacturer, that's limited in terms of the time. Funding for the purchase of the 8 new TVAs was approved as part of the fiscal year 2017-18 budget. And the company that we want to go with, Thermo Environmental Instruments, has offered an $8,000 trade-in allowance for the inoperable TVAs, which would be applied to the purchase of the new TVA units in an amount not to exceed $161,000. So this action basically seeks approval for the sole purchase of the 8 TVAs from Thermo Environmental and to authorize removal of the 8 existing TVA units from our inventory, which will be surrendered to the manufacturer at the time of purchase. If there's any questions, please let me know.
Are there any questions by my colleagues?
I'm just curious about the surrendering to the manufacturer. Do we have to give them back to them? Is that part of the PO, or
No,
just like a lease?
we don't have to. Basically, they're not worth much or anything to us right now, and by giving them back, we would get about $1,000 back for each one that we get, and then we could use that to help purchase the other ones.
Got it. Okay. I'll move approval.
Second.
Would the clerk call the roll?
Vice Chair Benoit?
Aye.
Councilmember Mitchell?
Aye.
Dr. Parker?
Aye.
Dr. Burke?
Aye.
Motion passes 4-0.
Mr. Weiss, about the item 10?
Dr. Burke, committee members. At last Friday's governing board meeting, the board considered proposed amendments to the board meeting procedures. Staff first presented the meeting procedures to the board at last July's governing board meeting. They were then presented at a public workshop held at the district on August 10th and at the September governing board meeting. At last Friday's governing board meeting, board members raised several issues that they wanted staff to bring back to the administrative committee. The first was defining a disruption as willfully speaking off topic. Next was the deadline for speaker cards. There was also a suggestion from the board to include a provision allowing a reduction in the total amount of speaker time based on the number of speakers that had signed up to address an item. And finally, there was a suggestion that speakers who were part of a group should be required to choose a spokesperson. Regarding disruptions, the proposal that was presented to the board at last Friday's meeting defined disruptions in part as willfully speaking on a subject not before the board. Board members raised several concerns regarding this definition. First, there was a concern that it was overbroad, and so speakers who were simply mistaken about the item that was before the board were subject to removal from the meeting. There was also a concern that the provision could apply to public comment on non-agenda items, and there's no subject before the board on those items. To address those concerns, we're now proposing that the provision be changed to read, willfully continuing to speak on an agenda item on a subject that is not relevant to the item after being warned by the chair. With respect to the deadline for submitting speaker cards, the proposal presented at last Friday's board meeting required speakers to submit cards before the board's consideration of an item. Under the current procedures, as they're currently worded, speakers are required to submit cards before the end of public testimony. At last Friday's board meeting, certain members expressed concern that requiring that cards be presented to the board prior to their consideration of an item would be unfair to speakers who decide to speak only after hearing other speakers on the item. A board member, however, has expressed the view that public comment is not public debate and favored the position that cards should be required before the board takes up an item. There were 2 additional proposals discussed by board members at last Friday's meeting that are intended to manage the opportunity for public comment when there is a large number of speakers. The existing board procedures have provisions that the chair can use when a lot of people sign up to comment on an item. First, the chair can reduce the amount of time allocated to each speaker. Second, on a voluntary basis, the chair can request that groups select a spokesperson who is given extra time to speak. Those procedures have worked well to manage limited speaking time when there is a large number of speakers, and so we are not recommending adding these 2 additional provisions. The next steps are to revise the procedures based on the input provided at today's meeting and to present the revised procedures for the board's consideration at the October board meeting. This concludes my presentation.
I'm confused, Kurt. So can you go back to the second last slide? Yeah, that one's fine. What you're saying is that you're not recommending that we reduce the total speaker time based on the number of speakers?
That's correct, Dr. Berg. So
Go back one more slide.
Sure. Back another one?
Okay, I just want to understand what you're recommending. And on this one, you're recommending what?
On this one,
Go back
One more,
go back
CC8.
one more.
Tell them I've got it here.
Oh, we've got it here, but you don't.
Back it up in CC8, please.
He's got it now. He's got it. Okay.
So
That's not, what do you?
the recommendation here would be to go with the proposal, which is to submit cards prior to the commencement of consideration of the item. Oh, I'm sorry. No, that's not correct, Dr. Burke. It's to stay with the existing procedure, which is that cards have to be filed prior to the close of public testimony.
You see, that's why it was confusing. Okay, you can take the cards down. Who was it on the board? To be honest, I didn't even hear the comment that said that this is public testimony, not public debate. Who said that?
It was a statement that was made after the board meeting. It was an email that I received.
By who? By who?
It was Councilman Robinson.
By who? I would have guessed Supervisor Nelson, but so I would have been totally wrong. But I happen to agree with that. And how did you come, what logic did you use to make these proposals?
The proposals were all based on reviewing the meeting procedures from the counties that are within the district's geographic area.
I want you to know, Kurt, I think you did a fine job on this. And just because I don't agree with some of the outcome doesn't mean I don't agree with the process by which you did it and in the manner in which you did it. So I'm be interested to hear what my colleagues have to say, and then I'll say what I have to say, and we'll see what happens here.
Chairman Burke.
Any comment?
Yes, Chairman Burke.
We'll hear.
On the item 30.5, which is receipt of testimony, and this would be the subdivision 3, time allotted for testimony. I have some concerns about how that is worded, and the wording that you have here is when any group of persons wishes to address the board on the same subject matter, the chair may request that a spokesperson be chosen to represent the group so as to avoid unnecessary repetition. What I'm proposing is to alter that wording to phrase it a little bit differently and offer sort of like an option to the group. So the chair could offer the group the option to choose a representative to speak for the group in lieu of reducing the 3-minute time limit for speakers in the organization. This would happen when you have a large group who comes forward and wants to have every member speak. I'm just thinking, the way it's worded, the chair can offer that, and what's the incentive for taking the offer? And what if the offer is refused? You're just back at, you're sort of back at stage 1. But what is anticipated here is that, of course, if there's a large group, we're going to reduce the time. And so you kind of tie those two together. I'm not sure that wording is the right wording, but I'm thinking that you could tie those two together so that there's an incentive to choose a spokesperson or 2 or 3 spokespersons. We don't have to limit the number. I mean, you have to limit it to some degree, but you could offer maybe 2 or 3 spokespersons instead of 20 people coming up and saying the same thing. That was my thinking along those lines. That maybe that could be worded a little differently, and we could have our lawyers figure that out. I don't know how you all feel about that, but that's up for discussion.
I agree with that. That's going down the right path, I would think.
I've seen this done in such a way that you come along and you say, you've got 20 people to speak. That would be an hour of time. Why don't we get it down to 3 or 4 people, and we'll give each one of those people 4 or 5 minutes, 5 minutes as an alternative to have that 15 versus that of 60. To let the group then decide, or otherwise, if you cannot decide, where everybody will be, I should say satisfied with the proposal, is to say we'll reduce the time then down to something that the chair would feel that is reasonable and acceptable. But I think the incentive would be is to give those 2 or 3 people or 1 person added more time so that they could make a more, fluid presentation would probably encompass many of the concerns or comments. Most of the times, I think we all can agree that when we've seen these, the people that would be making the repetitious statements are really kind of reading from an approved dossier that has already been given to them. So they're just coming up and reading the same thing over and over into the record. Whereby if someone had more time, they could then cover a lot more points than just those same repetitive points over and over again. So I think your suggestion, Mitchell, that we give some incentive for them to agree on. If they got a person who's probably very fluently and directly able to speak to the subject matter, they may be willing to accept that alternative instead of having everybody just come up and say the same thing.
Vice Chair Benoit, do you have some comment on this?
No, I think it's a good suggestion, and you're right, there definitely has to be some sort of incentive to get the group to want to do this. I think the only one I can think of is that, or, you know, you can take the option or we're going to have to limit the time. But you're always going to have other people outside of the group. So, you know, do we still limit the time for the other outsider groups or the other people beside the group?
Oh, yeah, when the time goes down, the time goes down. You can't take the time down for some people and not take it down for others.
Yeah.
See, here's my take on this, Kurt. I think we need to do what Ms. Mitchell is put the framework out here for. We need a number, whether it's 5 people or 10 people. If you're in that organized group, then you have the ability to organize, and we'll give you, instead of 30 minutes, we'll give you 15 minutes, or we take the time down to a minute, or a minute and a half, or 2 minutes, whatever. But so that it provides an incentive to go to the group package rather than stay with one person coming up every 3 minutes to read the same card. So, I think that I think we're going to have to send all this back to you to rewrite, to bring back to the admin committee meeting next month, so that we can get something that we can send forward that we think is appropriate. Because I don't think we can draft it from the rostrum today.
Mr. Chair, I have one other question. Kurt, when we state that the people will be disrupted if they're not speaking about the subject matter, is that inclusive of just regular public, on the agenda? Because if someone is going to do regular public speaking, public comment, the items will not be on the agenda.
Right.
How do we make a distinction between that and what we are saying here? I understand what this is saying, and I don't necessarily disagree with what that is saying, but the question itself is, at the end of even our committee meetings, and then my second question, you can answer that, are these same rules applicable to our committees as well as that of the board? Because in the actual packet, it only talks about governing board meetings and not necessarily committee.
Right. Yeah, and just on that last point, Dr. Parker, the provisions by their very terms just apply to meetings of the governing board. It would be easy and maybe a good idea even to apply them, to change that so that they do apply to committee meetings as applicable. I mean, there are certain things in here I think that just apply to governing board meetings. On your earlier point, whether somebody speaking during public comment at the end of a board meeting or at the end of a committee meeting would be subject to this willfully speaking on a topic not before the board. That was meant to be addressed by saying that it's only a disruption if they're willfully continuing to speak during an agenda item. So the idea there was that if they're speaking about something other than the particular agenda item before the board, they'd be subject to the provision. But during general public comment, when there's really no agenda item before the board, this provision wouldn't apply.
What about if they came and be disruptive in reference to the end in itself of the public comment and doing the same kind of things? Let me ask you the question because I don't know what we should probably, since we're really dealing with the subject matter, cover that as well. If someone wants to get up and kind of demonstrate at the end of the board meeting and before we adjourn,
Yeah.
or whatever it may be, would they be subject to the same kind of?
That's a good suggestion, Dr. Parker, and the way that some of the counties have addressed that is by saying that it's a disruption for somebody to disobey a lawful direction from the chair. So, putting that.
I would suggest we add that.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Now, back to the deadline for the speaker's cards. Let me give my 2 cents worth. If I hear Larry say something in public testimony that I don't agree with, and I run it and I put in the speaker's card, and I get up and I say, Larry doesn't know what he's talking about. This is the way it really is. It would seem to me Larry would have a right to say, I don't agree with Bill.
It goes on and on.
And it goes on and on, So I don't agree with this thing. Like, if you hear something that somebody says, you have the right to fill out a speaker's card to go up and contradict that. If you have something to say, it's public testimony. If you have something to say, say it. I think Dwight was absolutely right on target. It's not public debate. It's public testimony. And I just am of the firm belief, if you're going to speak on an item, now, if I had my druthers, I'd rather make the deadline the beginning of the meeting. But I know nobody's going to stand still for that. But when an item is being heard, I would think that this thing of bringing in, to be honest, I'm trying to not only make this better for myself, but any future chairman on this board. It's just debilitating to have these cards continuing to come up, sometimes a half hour into testimony on an item. So I definitely am not going to be in support of the existing rule.
Mr. Chairman, if I could comment.
Sure.
I think my own political philosophy here is to err in favor of allowing speech and comments about our agenda. And it can also happen that somebody arrives a little bit late to the meeting and they couldn't speak after the item is already closed, but if the item is under discussion, it seems that they ought to be allowed to come forward and speak. So I'm in favor of the existing rule and in favor of erring in favor of allowing comment rather than disallowing it. I know it's a little bit more cumbersome for the chair, but I think, we are a public agency. We're here to hear the public. And I think it's a little bit constrictive to cut it off, if they haven't filed their card up front. It may be that the person isn't just coming forward to dispute what somebody else has said. They may have a new comment that they want to make that sheds some light on the subject matter for the board, and I think it's better to err in favor of that kind of comment and to keep the process open rather than to constrict it.
I respect that. Kurt? What is the practice you found of the other boards on this item, on this matter?
Los Angeles County requires a card be submitted before the item is called, before an item is called. So that would essentially be the proposal. San Bernardino is essentially the same. It's prior to the time the chairperson calls the item for the board's consideration. Orange County is a little mixed. It's prior to the end of the public comments portion of the meeting, or in the event of a public hearing prior to the start of the public hearing. So if there's a public hearing, it would be what the proposal is.
Right.
And then Riverside is prior to a vote of the board.
So the majority of them are when the item is called, right?
Before the item is called, yes.
Before the item's called.
Well, you know, Mr. Chair, if we're going to have a hearing, and this is where this usually transpires more so than just one of the other kind of items, it really should be closure at some point in time. In reference, there are all kinds of procedures, even in the court of law, that you just can't keep on going back and forth over and over and over again without the permission itself of the chair.
Right.
I just think that if we don't have some rules, you know, that people then know that these are the rules in the beginning, and even, I would say for Councilwoman Mitchell's comment, if someone arrived late, it could be at the discretion of the chair. If there was a reason, a valid reason, and we don't have to specifically state them, that they were basically coming in late, they would ask for special permission, the chair could grant that individual that particular exception. There's nothing wrong with giving the chair those kind of discretions, but to have it as a general rule, we could have hundreds of people sitting there and let's just keep bringing cards up and down. And I don't think that should not be the intent itself of it. But I think Mrs. Mitchell is correct. We should have some kind of discretion to allow for extenuating circumstances.
So,
I agree.
Chair, perhaps the wording must be filed before the item is taken up, unless the chair, in his discretion, should decide that the speaker could be heard.
I'm going to put a good cause.
Good cause argument. Yeah, I mean that might be acceptable to everybody.
You know, I'll make a quick comment if I can. You know, that adds, again, a burden back to the chair of having to make a decision on whether or not to allow someone. I wonder if we ought to come up with a hardline time. You know, after an item has been called and public comment has commenced, after 15 minutes of public comment, no more cards will be accepted. And that way you can capture the people that get there late, up to 15 minutes, but the chair doesn't have to be making a on-the-board decision. And the other thing I see happen in a lot of my public meetings, and I've seen it happen here too, where even after the public comment has stopped, then we've gone to some debate, and then back and forth, we'll still accept sometimes a card. And I've seen boards do that, like the Riverside County Board, like was mentioned, they allow it even up to the vote. So I do feel we need to have some sort of a hardline time to stop accepting cards, but I wonder if we ought to leave that to a specific time after the public debate has started.
I think it's an interesting suggestion. I think, I don't know the answer here, but I do know that how I feel about it. So, Kurt, why don't you work on this, ruminate? Why don't you be in touch with Councilwoman Mitchell and make sure that her concerns on people that arrive tardy are somehow integrated in our policy, because sometimes there are circumstances which are beyond your control, and maybe the time thing does provide us with a time certain. If you're going to be more than 15 minutes late, but I don't, it's you're taking a real risk on the item being either finished or under debate. So I'm going to leave that to Kurt and to bring it back to us next month. And be in touch with Ms. Mitchell. Okay, Mr. Alatorre?
Yes, sir, that's just a written report on this local gov small business advisory group. No motion required.
Any other business before the admin committee meeting this morning? Is there any public testimony in CC8? There's no public testimony here at the Lux. So that adjourns the admin committee meeting for today.